Happening this afternoon, President Biden hosting the leaders of South Korea and Japan, the first ever trilateral summit with the U.S. and those two countries. The gathering in Camp David brings the two Asian powers together after decades of tension and mistrust.
It's not only the first summit I've hosted at Camp David, it's the first ever standalone summit between the leaders of Japan and Republic of Korea and the United States. And I can think of no better way to mark our new chapter of our trilateral cooperation than meeting here at Camp David. Our countries are stronger and the world will be safer as we stand together.
Their common goal today, a show of unity and force in the face of a rising China and increasingly provocative North Korea as well. Joining us now, Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin. He chairs the House Select Committee on China, also sits on both the Intelligence and Armed Services Committee. Thanks so much for taking the time this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
The U.S. stand against China is a relatively bipartisan issue, a rare one in Washington today, and that's part of this message today in this summit with South Korea and Japan. I wonder, in your view, is the U.S. doing what it needs to counter China economically and militarily?
Well, let me first say, when it comes to this summit, this is a massive positive step forward, and I applaud President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida for putting aside historical sensitivities to come together for this historic meeting. For decades, we've had bilateral alliances with Japan and South Korea. They've been important. They've fostered security. But our ties have remained bilateral, and our position has been weaker as a result. Now we're going to have a series of trilateral cooperative efforts, and I think it does nothing but enhance peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, particularly as we think about the fact that a few weeks ago we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the armistice ending the Korean War, a war that claimed thousands of American lives and many more Korean lives. It should remind us that we need to do everything possible to deter and prevent a war before it's too late. To get to your direct question, I think on that issue, what we're not doing with a sense of urgency is surging hard power west of the international date line to put hard power in Xi Jinping's path so that he doesn't look across the Taiwan Strait and think he can make a move and achieve his lifelong ambition. That's really run into a lot of bureaucratic logjam in the Pentagon and in other agencies. So it's why we need to work in a bipartisan fashion in Congress to ensure that we're putting in place a deterrent posture that convinces Xi that he cannot achieve that ambition.
On Taiwan, I hear two different scenarios. You hear of the danger, of course, of a full-scale invasion, but increasingly I hear warnings about something short of that, a suffocation strategy, encircling Taiwan to economically strangle it, threaten it into political surrender. Which do you view as more likely, and do you think that it's just a matter of time that one of those things is going to happen?
Well, I'll confess I focus mostly on the conventional threat of an amphibious assault and military invasion. However, when I went to Taiwan a few months ago, someone said something that still haunts me, which is that, you may not be able to swallow a porcupine, but you can starve it. And so I left thinking we needed to pay more attention to the blockade scenario, the economic coercion scenario. In fact, you can make a case that sort of economic and cyber invasion of Taiwan has already begun. When the Select Committee on China that I chair did a war game, in fact, one of the key findings we came away with was that while we have sort of a theory of the case when it comes to conventional and strategic deterrence, i.e. military deterrence, we don't incorporate the economic and financial analysis. We don't incorporate what are the economic and financial weapons we are willing to use in order to prevent the invasion. And in some cases, Treasury, Commerce, and other non-DoD entities aren't even at the table when it comes to wargaming out the scenario. So we need to do a better job of that. We have some legislation that would force that, but that's the analysis that we haven't been paying as much attention to traditionally.
For decades, Americans have been hearing about China's inexorable rise, and the numbers have backed that up, near double-digit growth for a long time. But now the trend line's in the opposite direction. You've got a whole host of negative economic indicators there. There's talk of peak China, that it's already passed the peak of its economic growth. I wonder, is China a greater or lesser threat to the U.S. as it weakens economically?
Well, my concern, and all this is a working hypothesis, I can't fully prove it, is that as Xi Jinping confronts those near-term economic issues, but really confronts the looming demographic issues that will become most acute in the 2030s, he's going to hit a demographic buzzsaw that no society in history has really dealt with. I think that could actually make him more aggressive in the near term. He himself is 69 or 70 years old. So if you believe, as I do, that he's serious about achieving that lifelong ambition of taking Taiwan, I think the next 5 years are the most dangerous. It's what I've called the window of maximum danger. It's also when we have some major defense issues that we're dealing with, some big bills that are coming due, and our Navy continues to get smaller and smaller and could potentially bottom out at 279 ships at 2027. And that's, of course, the target date Xi Jinping has set for his military to be ready to invade Taiwan. So I think he actually becomes more aggressive in the near term.
You have been consistent in terms of standing up not just for Taiwan, but also Ukraine in the face of Russia's invasion. As you know, some of your fellow Republicans have wavered in their support or even publicly opposed U.S. military support for Ukraine. You've got a GOP, the first presidential primary debate coming up next week. Do you want to hear a unified party position saying we stand with Ukraine against Russia and will do whatever it takes to help them defend themselves?
Well, I certainly want to hear where the candidates stand on the issue. Within the idea of supporting Ukraine, there can be reasonable disagreements, right? I, for example, don't support a blank check, as in nobody gets a blank check, not even our national security agencies. But I think we need to continue to provide lethal clinical support to the Ukrainians and put ourselves in a position to shape the outcome on the ground. And I think it's not logical to separate the issue of what's happening in Eastern Europe completely from what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, because we, of course, have a no-limits partnership between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. So I guess all I'm asking for when the debate comes to Wisconsin next week is that we just see where the candidates stand. And again, they can disagree about a few issues, but it's at least my view that we can't abandon the cause completely in Ukraine because it has an impact on what happens in the Indo-Pacific, which is our priority theater.